All right, so welcome to our March webinar. This is going to be all about how to write goals and objectives for oral and written language. We'll get into some specifics. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Dr. Megan Kirby. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Director of Dissemination and Implementation programs at Language Dynamics Group, the publisher of cubed assessments, diamond, pearl, and then the interventions related to Story Champs, both the kit and our new AAC expansion pack. Let me go ahead and also kind of go over the agenda for tonight or today, depending on where you are in the world. We're going to go ahead. Oh, let me turn. Good. The captions are on. So background information, brief. We'll go over the why we do what we do, the use of cubed 3 and how to use our measures to inform instruction. I'll also mention how you can use the pearl and the diamond assessments. We'll go into goal formatting. These are just recommendations, so they're not rules. And of course, you have to take into consideration what is required from your district or your agency or your funder. And so I will admit that there's some flexibility in some of these things, but they're just general guide for you to use. And then we'll go over how to use the tools, specifically the cubed forms, the narrative language measures for progress monitoring of your intervention. So is what you're doing working? And then last but not least, we'll have time for questions and answers and a certificate form that you will fill out. Okay, so will warn you, there are going to be, not warn you, there are going to be 2 special keywords that you're going to need to write down. And then on the form for the checkout for the certificate, you need to fill in what those secret words were that were presented up on the slides. So if you are curious about, can you watch this webinar later? Can you share it with anybody else? We will get it to you. Please give us about 48 hours, if not sooner, but at 48 hours, business hours for us to upload the recording and get a synopsis for you, and then also access to the certificate link in case you miss it tonight. All right, without further ado, I do want to introduce you to who we are. So Dr. Trina Spencer and Dr. Doug Peterson are the key players in terms of developing the measures and the intervention. So Story Champs, Cubed, Pearl, Diamond, they're our big researchers too. So we have them to thank for and their work at their respective universities that they work for full time, in addition to helping get that research to practice gap down by publishing the results of their research, like Story Champs, Diamond, Pearl, etc. Cubed. We have other people. We've got Shane, and then Christy is also on here. If you ever email the training email, so training@languagedynamicsgroup.com, there she is. So it's going to be one of us who are going to answer that. Know that if you email training@languagedynamicsgroup.com, not any of our other emails like from our website, you're going to actually get this. And so we can help you really quickly. Just a little tip. Then we have, there's our lovely graphic designer. So we've got Olivia Peterson, we've got Cameron, she also helps. Roger and Karen, and then their children. So these are the people in the warehouse who are shipping you your products. So this is it. This is our family. It's small. I'm probably missing like one other person. So, but we are all in North America. So my friends over there in Australia and New Zealand and around the world, thank you for bearing with us in the time frames. I think this works for you though. It's 7 o'clock at night for me. These are our products. You're going to obviously see that we have cubed. We're going to go over that today. And then Story Champs a little bit. We're not going to talk about intervention, but how can you write goals and objectives related to the intervention if you're going to use it? Okay. So we design assessments so that you have quick, efficient, easy, and effective, valid, reliable assessments so that you can screen. So using the Pearl, the cubed, and diagnose, this is new, the diamond to use as a diagnostic tool. I'll show you a little bit more later. And then what do you do when you have a problem? Well, we're going to address the upper strands of Scarborough's reading rope. We are huge proponents of the science of reading. and the science of behavior. So combine those two, and you're going to get really effective programs, story champs, and easy peasy. The cubed goes right into helping progress monitor for story champs in case that is your intervention. But you can use these measures and not have story champs, and that's fine. So I'm going to go over this. I don't know who's here, right? So I'm going to go over some key points about why we need clear and precise goals, why they matter. Should be a no-brainer, but we might have other folks here, and this is new, so we have some students sometimes. All right, so I want to go over that. I'm going to talk about annual goals first, so like the big picture. They always come from what is the ultimate outcome that we want to see for this learner or the student. The annual goal, I'm going to say annual, but it could be the term or life of that particular student's plan or client's plan if it's a medical model. It could be a treatment plan for outpatient speech and language services, what have you. But this is what the learner is expected to accomplish in the course of that plan's duration. And it must include a target behavior, so observable, measurable. The condition or the context, the given, right? You have to have mastery, performance criteria, and you have to have a timeline. All of these things go into a really good goal. And why do we need it? Well, in the US, we're actually required to. I'll show you on the next slide. There's been 2 Supreme Court cases that still hold. I know a lot else is going on with the Department of Education, but this is still in place as of today. And these goals are going to be what allow you to communicate effectively with stakeholders, meaning the student themselves, respecting them and communicating to them what their goal is so that they can achieve it. And also with family members, right? The primary stakeholders in that student's life. When you're talking about progress, if you write a good goal, you're going to be able to report progress really easily, and that establishes more trust. Okay. So over the years, there have been 2 really important court cases. There's been more, but at the US Supreme Court, and they've reinforced the fact that students must have access to the general curriculum. They must have standards-based IEPs or individualized student or education programs. So high expectations, right? You can't have a low bar. That's not going to be a good idea. And if there is too low of a bar, then the student isn't really accessing the general curriculum, right? You're setting the bar too low. What I would say to that, think about how if you've got a student who does not need any specialized services or supports, they're expected to advance from grade to grade. That is considered appropriately ambitious for students who without any special needs. So their expectation is that they will achieve their grade level expectations or these standards they're going to meet enough to progress to the next grade. Well, for students with disabilities, their educational program must be appropriately ambitious in the same light of their circumstances. So sometimes in order to achieve or be able to make progress towards those standards, there's a big gap, right? But as long as you can prove that you're working on skills that would allow them to have access, if they master these skills, it would allow them to have access to those general curriculum standards, then we're good. All right. So I would suggest, does your student have the ability to paraphrase, summarize, retell what might be read to them, right? Or what they might read? And if not, well, then that's probably a really good idea to target intervention for older students. Can they write a summary about a passage they just read too, right? So these are all things that help our students with disabilities access the general curriculum. Like there are key skills that open up doors. And so that's where we want to focus on those, all right? If you have any specifics, this is not an IEP law or special education law for the US, but this is in general, this came out in 2015. This still holds true. Feel free to throw questions, by the way, into the Q&A, and then Christy and I will absolutely, kind of answer you. So, all right. This one right here, I love this quote. Assessment should serve as a baseline for treatment or intervention goals. They have to be used, right? When you're trying to compare progress monitoring data, like during the intervention period, back to where the learner was at the beginning before you intervened. Okay. If you're not assessing appropriately, how are you measuring and reporting progress? You can't. If baseline isn't assessed appropriately, you have nothing to compare to. So rather than like this, again, is a no-brainer to me because it's the way I was trained, but you have to have some kind of like before intervention measure that is comparable to what's going to go on. And that's why I say like the cubed is perfect. The cubed was actually developed to measure the efficacy of story champs. So that's how they go hand in hand. You could read our tons, like 30 something peer-reviewed published research articles. We use the cube, the narrative language measures. And that is really why. So we want to be able to compare progress monitoring data to itself, but also back to baseline. So use a good assessment up front. All right. We also have other assessments. And so we often get asked, where do I start with story champs, right? Or more broadly, where should I start with any language goal with my learner? And the first thing you got to do is conduct a full, relevant, meaningful assessment of the learner's needs. We have 3 published assessments. It looks like 4 here, but the 2 here in the middle, this is what comprises the cubed measures. I always tell you to think about it in the way of like to the 3rd power. So the cubed being like, we've got these 3 powerful assessments. But we also have the pearl and the diamond. Okay. So I will start with them first. The preschool, kindergarten, universal language and early literacy screener. So predictive early assessment of reading and language. That's the pearl. So that is intended for end of preschool. So you're talking about 4 years old to like beginning of kindergarten or primary school, whatever you call it. So you're talking about you're entering your first formal year of education. So that's the pearl. And that predicts 8 years into the future who has dyslexia or who has DLD or both. It's that strong, and it is a dynamic assessment. On the right, we also have the diamond. This is new, super exciting, really strong evidence. And that's a dynamic assessment that it doesn't look like this now, by the way. This is an old picture, I'm just realizing. It's way better. It's actually a diagnostic tool, okay, for kindergarten through primary, like primary/8th grade. This is an example of how it's really good at diagnosing DLD and dyslexia. It uses a test, teach, retest format of the dynamic assessment. So the student does not pass that pretest, which we don't expect. Then we're looking at the composite skill itself of the ability to learn, because they're going to use really good teaching, like evidence-based teaching practices that are proven in research for decades, very long time. And you're teaching using those step-by-step methods. And then you're also looking at to what extent how difficult is it for this learner to learn the material that you just taught, also in a one-to-one context, right? So imagine if they had a lot of difficulty learning through all of these like prompt fading procedures, this is explicit instruction. Imagine that in a whole classroom, if they will absolutely have difficulties, right? And so if you need more information about this and the diamond training at languagedynamicsgroup.com. You can also look up our YouTube channel, and there's tons of videos and other webinars that we've had. Okay, let me just double check. Nicole asks, is the pearl free to download like the cube? No, our diagnostic assessments are not free. So, and the universal screeners. So the cubed is free to download, paper pencil. It will be forever. And I'll go over that, but that is a benchmarking. So that's not intended or meant for that. Lisa asks, I find the cubed incredibly difficult to score. So report it on subjectively. Do it. Well, Lisa, I'm going to show you a slide that says, here's training that we've created for this. So this goes beyond the scope of this particular webinar, but also we have like 7 hours of training in the cube, going into administration, scoring, reporting, all of that. Okay. So this is what the cubed is. This is, in general, we want to take these 2 strands of Scarborough's rope. This is our interpretation of it. We even have another slide that goes way more into depth as to what background knowledge even means, right? literacy knowledge, meaning like discourse structure, not front cover of the book, back cover of the book, author illustrator, but like expository discourse, narrative discourse, the structure, the elements that make up these types of literature, right? So guess what? Bottom left hand here, word recognition. There's already like really good measures out there. So we don't mean to recreate the wheel. We have dynamic assessment associated with this, the procedures in the cubed, but we're really known for the cubed, the narrative language measures. So the upper strands of Scarborough's rope. This is probably what's not, I'm going to go ahead and say it. This is what's not getting taught explicitly and systematically in our schools. Why? Because it's really hard to measure it. And if you're not measuring it, meaning you're not testing it right with valid measures that are reliable, that are also empirically supported, so by multiple studies, then chances are you don't know what's not getting taught, right? And so this is the issue that we have. There's tons of assessments out there, like screeners and benchmarking systems that say that they do it. But as you'll see a little bit more into depth, does not, because you need all of the things that are here. So the narrative language measures is, I would say like, well, it's 2/3 of the cube. Dynamic decoding measures will measure and report on specific word recognition skills, whereas the narrative language measures, we have two different forms, listening and reading. Those are going to give you all the information you need on every single strand, the upper strands of Scarborough's rope. So let's take a closer look. So here you go. This is specific information that you're going to get from the dynamic decoding measures, or DDM that we call it. These are word recognition skills, right? And when you administer this assessment, you're finding out to what extent does this learner need intervention to access the expectations, at grade level expectations, or are they already on benchmark or above? And then if they are at risk, to what degree are they at risk? Are they at moderate risk or high risk? But you're going to get like individualized information instead of saying, oh, they're at risk for decoding. Well, specifically what? What is holding them back? Where do they need targeted intervention? And the cubed is there for you for the dynamic decoding measures to give you actually specific goals, right? So you don't have to administer another assessment again to find out, okay, well, what specifically in the area of decoding or phonemic awareness do they need to work on? So think of this almost as like your annual goal, and you've got definitely component skills that come under these umbrellas that you're going to have this information for. So for my teachers out there, wonderful test. Now, this is probably what gets most use, especially in particular, hand in hand with story champs and progress monitoring for efficacy for that. The narrative language measures. So N as in Nancy, L as in Larry, M as in Mary. So NLM. You'll hear me using that acronym probably for the remainder of the webinar. But these two types of assessments, there's reading and listening. They are going to provide explicit information about a student's performance in those upper strands of Scarborough's rope. Okay, so you're going to get information if you administer the NLM listening or the NLM reading. Both are the same with the exception of writing versus oral story generation and reading fluency. Of course, you're not going to get reading fluency measured by just the NLM listening, but you're going to get one, narrative discourse and expository discourse. That's your literacy knowledge. If I went back to the rope. Episode complexity, sentence complexity, vocabulary complexity. We have factual questions. So answering WH questions, you have to administer the assessment. There is bolded font. That means it's a script. You have to read it word for word. And you're going to have to follow it from top to bottom in order that it appears. Right here, what you see is our digital administration, or the platform, we call it Insight. That is not free. Obviously, your paper pencil forms would be free. Visually aggressive, I know, we'll take a look at it, but it's free. And so when you're going to get the same content, the digital version also has some dynamic features for factual questions built in that is not available on the paper forms. But you're going to get all of these things. So you're going to have information when someone says, oh, the student has comprehension problems. That's happened. I will get reports of like, do you have an intervention for comprehension? Well, tell me more. What part of comprehension? Like, are you talking about they need intervention and background knowledge, or are they fine? Vocabulary, language. So there's all these component skills, and we need an assessment that tells us, okay, what part of comprehension or parts, there's always priorities and trade-offs, but what part of comprehension are you talking about when you say a student has comprehension problems? And that's why the narrative language measures it stands out as one of the only assessments. It's the only one that I know that is actually measuring all of these skills. So let's say you find a student at high risk on one of these subtests, like retail, all right? And you're going to be able to, in Insight, it groups your students for you in terms of areas of need. But if you're using the paper pencil forms, you're gonna want to group students by the consistent, I'm gonna give you a decision idea, priorities and trade-offs. I'm gonna give you a decision kind of flowchart in a way about what to work on when there's so much to work on, but you want to group students by the ultimate in order of, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, episode complexity is where you need to start usually. And so you've got them in groups, and then you're going to deliver an intervention that's going to target that particular overarching goal, right? You can individualize and differentiate with, like, you're working on articulation with this kid, but they also can't retell a complete episode. Whereas this student is working on answering WH questions about a passage read to them, but they also cannot do a retell that has a complete episode either. So you can see how like the similarities are all going to be retelling using a complete episode. Now, we have progress monitoring forms that I'll get to in a little bit after we talk about how to format our goals, but we want to be able to use this assessment to address, is intervention working? If you are pulling a Story Champs lesson plan for vocabulary, then you want to use a measure where it's going to tell you whether or not that Story Champs lesson plan for vocabulary is working, right? Okay. I'm throwing this up here because a lot of folks don't know. You saw how many people work for the organization, so it's like all hands on deck, and we're doing our best with dissemination. Please share it. It is a little bit over 7 hours long, right? It's a course that's asynchronous, so it's at your own pace. It's online. You get 60 days to complete it. There's short modules. There's 20 modules, and it goes over how to administer all of the measures within the cube, so GDM and NLM, how to score, how to interpret those scores, right? How to group students based on those scores, how to report your scores and write them up, and then how to progress monitor and then inform decisions about your intervention. Please check out this online asynchronous training course that we offer. It is beyond the scope of this training. It's wonderful content. So Christy and I made it based on feedback. So, all right. Also, Christy put in, Christy, you have to do that for everybody. I think you sent it to me. So Christy's going to put in the chat the link to download the paper pencil cubed form. All right. So if you do have questions there, please take care of it. Okay. And again, well, after you've done the training and you still have questions, you have access to Christy and I, and we give you that information later. Tons of free downloads too with that course. Let's get back to slides. Sorry. Get excited about things, but let's just say that we did a great assessment. I used that narrative language measures, let's say, and I want to know what my student should work on and like priorities and trade-offs. Like I keep mentioning that because there are always a bunch of things to work on. So in general, here's the suggestions that we give you. Obviously, oral language is easier to master. Students should become more proficient in that first before written language is developed. Developmentally, this makes sense, right? So we don't want splinter skills. This is what we should be working on in this order, this developmental sequence as well, in order for our students to acquire these skills in appropriate sequence. So let's say you've got an older student and they need to work on writing stories. Well, can they tell a story? Can they generate it orally first? You can't write what you can't say. So if you need a written language goal, you need to be working on oral first and boost their proficiency and mastery of all of the skills that go into then a written language sample, and work on it oral first. Next, retell. So with the narrative language measures, listening or reading, where you have a narrative that is beautiful, it's well written. There's so much work that goes into it that I think one day, Christy and I should go over like what it takes to make one of these NLM forms. I'm surprised my eye is not twitching. So like the certain number of noun verb modifiers and causal and temporal subordinate clauses and tier 2 vocabulary and tier 3 vocabulary. All of that goes into this one narrative that you end up reading or the student reads for a little bit. It's a very good story. It should be easy because all of that information is provided to the learner. Easy in air quotes. Should be easy for that learner to then spit that back out when you're saying, thanks for listening or thanks for reading and listening. Now you tell me that exact same story. Try to include as many details as you can in your story. All right. When I say that, I'm hoping that they can retell that story with at least one of the complete episodes. If there's 2 episodes, then hopefully both. Why? Well, I gave them a story that it was great. It had all the parts it needed to in a sequence that it needed to be in, and it was developmentally appropriate for them, meaning it didn't have too much stuff. It didn't have a million episodes, and some of them, like I think Stella Luna about the bat, too many episodes. Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus, one of my favorite books. Too many problems, and not all of them are solved before there's another problem. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of we want something that's very simple. You need to be able to tell someone else's story or like retell a good story in order to do so to learn discourse structure as well as sentence level complexity. So we're talking about the causal, temporal, subordinate clauses, tier 2 vocabulary, etc. It's easier for students to acquire all of the sentence and word level skills if it's a retell. And then once you have that proficient, then we should be working on personal stories, right? So we shouldn't just skip to personal generation. That being said, let's say we can retell a story that has a complete episode and it sounds like a story, right? Novel story, not memorized. Well, once they have that, then we need to be working on telling your own story, because that gets into huge lifelong consequences and is an important life skill, right? Self-advocacy, telling someone your story, coping with trauma, all of these things. Well, because you have your own background experiences and you can bring those to the table, that's easier than generating a fictional story. Sometimes I'll hear back from people about autistic learners or students with autism, however they identify, and folks will say, oh, they skip personal storytelling. They can generate a fictional story. Every time I've heard that, we end up going back later on, finding out that they're actually scripting some other story that the interventionist had no idea. They thought they were creating a story, but it turns out to be something that they like, or a TV show or a movie or a book that interventionist just wasn't aware of. So it's actually a retell. So it makes sense that they're still at the personal storytelling phase. So work on personal mastering skills, discourse, sentence, and word, personal stories before you start asking them to generate fictional content, which relies heavily on background knowledge. Like you need to know about aliens or other worlds or the pyramids or whatever in order to generate a story, a fictional story about those things, right? And then, of course, it's easier to retell or generate a story when you've got pictures, but no one is following our learners around. Actually, maybe one person. I still keep in touch with he's like 23 years old, one of my former students. And yes, he has a device and he's always with someone. So, but not every picture is always available, right? So we want to get learners to the greatest extent possible to be able to express themselves without relying on pictures only, to the greatest extent possible. So let's see. Any questions, Christy? You're doing a great job of keeping up with these Q&As.
Yeah, we're doing good, so.
Good. Okay. Keep on going. So let's take a look at this right here. What you see is, this is the paper pencil form for the kindergarten end of year benchmark. All right. This is, I know, visually aggressive, but it's beautiful. It's only one page. Bolded font, right? You say word for word. But what you're looking at here in this retell with these orange dots, that's the score of the learner when they were providing their retell. This is what we do first. So I'm listening to their story, and here's your priority. Does the student retell a novel story, something they've never heard, with a complete episode? Right? If you're using Story Champs and you're working on retelling a story with a complete episode, like basic or enhanced or enhanced plus, any of those, if you're using a lesson plan with retell and then one of those story structures, the student should be able to listen to any story that is very similar in length, so it has only one episode, and it has things that come in a specific order, so they're written very closely. We follow a formula. They should be able to retell any story that they hear that would be presented here. All right. And we'll get it into, using off grade level forms in a little bit. But your first question to ask yourself is this right here, episode 1 complexity, or EC1. Does the student retell a novel story with a complete episode? A complete episode is I hate the standards, so I say beginning, middle, and end. It's actually a problem. So the reason why you're telling the story or the retell, right? An action or an attempt to solve the problem, and a consequence and or ending. So does your student or your learner have a score of a 3, 4, or 5? If not, I already have your animal goal. It's retelling a single episode story to include, but not limited to, problem, attempt or action, consequence, and or ending. And you can change the words to fit like the standards, like resolution instead of ending. Completely up to you. So that's number 1. So this learner right here did not retell using a complete episode. They're close. They got the problem and they have an attempt, but there was nothing at the end. So if I were listening to the story, I'm going to be like, then what happened? And when I'm asking questions and that information was provided in that they were listening to, then this is something that I would be working on for their goals. Now, once that's mastered, once you have a learner that can retell a story, a novel story that they haven't heard before, with a score of 3, 4, or 5, then we get into sentence level complexity. All right, look over here. You need to have a learner that not only do they have a complete episode, but it's interesting. So when you have more events, we want to see variety. We want to see temporal and causal subordinate clauses. First, causal. So the words because, so that. Then we want to see, after they've got that proficient in their repertoire, we want to see temporal subordination. Okay. Now, the extent to which you have a number of these, I'll get into a little bit later, but in the back of the cubed manual, we provide, and this is strictly for the Common Core state standards as a guide, but it's not like aligned with everybody's state. And then again, for my friends who are all over the world, you want to look at your standards that are for your locality. Okay. And we provide a guide for what is expected at the end of the year for each grade level, just the end. So what are their grade level expectations? And we break it down about approximately how many of these are expected in order to achieve this particular standard. Okay. So if you have any questions about that, we go further into depth in that cube training, by the way. But that's priority number 2. So first is episode, second is sentence complexity, and then third is going to be vocabulary complexity. From this, I can also tell you what the strengths are of my learner. I can say they're real strong. They can use proper nouns in a retell of a novel story. They include the setting, which is not time, because that's a construct to like most everybody, especially after a pandemic, but what were you doing and where were you? Like what was going on? Where was the character and what were they doing before they experienced the problem? So they're good there. They are complete and coherent in providing the problem in the story, right? And an attempt, complete coherent attempt. So, but those are strengths. The areas of need for targeted intervention, explicit instruction are going to be some kind of ending, a consequence and or an ending in order to have a complete episode. They also are using one temporal clause here, like when or while. I don't know which one. I'm pretty sure it's a when. And I can use that as a strength. And in fact, kindergarten really only expect one anyway. So And then vocabulary, look, like they had 2 tier 2 words that they used independently in their retail, which is wonderful. Okay. All right. We keep checking. All right. Do. All right. I think standard scores. Oh, anybody who's asking about standard scores and Z-scores, this is not a norm test. Okay. This is benchmarking. So when benchmarking is this, where is the student in comparison to where they need to be at this particular time of year, according to the standards that we've used to develop this criterion reference measure. If you're looking for anything diagnostic for eligibility, that's going to be the pearl or the diamond. So I just want to throw that out there. Different needs. Okay, so this is a criterion, standardized criterion referenced measure. Also norms stink because it's normal that only 4 out of 10 kids can read at grade level in 4th grade. Super. That's normal. So continue that. You can get me on a soapbox with that and we'll be here all night, which I don't want to be. All right. Here's another example. I am going to tell you, please do not pick more than 3 targets, like goals. And that's a lot. That's assuming that you have time for intervention with these learners for a while, right? You have more than 1 hour a week, or you have more than a half an hour a week that you see them if you're going to write that many goals. So priorities, trade-offs, right? This one right here, this learner, they have a problem, attempt, concept. So they have a beginning, middle, and end. So they have a score of at least a 3, 4, or 5. So guess what? We don't have to work on retells with complete episode. There are weaknesses. I wouldn't even say weaknesses. There are needs for maybe more practice. And maybe it's because they don't have a really good at tier 1 or core program that's going to be giving them passages to read or being read to them that are only going to have 1 episode. They're missing things like the setting. So they only had either the location or the activity before the problem. They don't have a resolution that's fully developed. And they didn't have a feeling in response to the problem. Plan, depending on the age, we look at that. That's correlated with executive functioning and some other things. But we give you more information. It's good to have a plan. It actually is, when students start using them, they start actually getting better at problem solving and like pre-planning themselves personally. So I'm looking at this, but my learner only used 1 because. So there wasn't a when or an after, any of those. There were no modifiers. So we're looking at something right here in this particular case that I would want to work on than sentence level complexity. Story questions, they're doing pretty well. It kind of mirrors the way they are in the retail. But I will say here, vocabulary questions. To what extent can learners use context clues to infer the meaning of an unknown word, right? And this is the general area of weakness that I would say that this needs targeted instruction is inferencing, vocabulary inferencing. So the cubed will definitely help you. All right, for the first word, the code word for the checkout form for your certificate is going to be measurable. All right, so write that down. It's going to be measurable. All right. Goal formatting. So I'm going to present some goals soon, and I want to make sure that you know why they're written the way they're written. We want to make sure our goals have to be objective. They have to be measurable, right? If we're able to observe it in some way and count it, I'm a behavior analyst. We love this stuff. But if you can observe it in some way and count it with your own eyes, then that's great. However, when you have more than 1 skill or behavior in the same goal, one might improve and the other one doesn't, but you may not know that, right? So you want them to also be discrete. You don't want them to cancel each other out. So you don't want to have difficulty knowing what is exactly going on, like where is the area of need. So don't cut corners is my recommendation. Do not include more than one skill or behavior in that goal to make it easier on knowing what's working and what's not, right? 30 goals. So I used to be one where I'd have way too many goals because I would write too many for discrete things. Think about, are there any that lead to, are there any behaviors, we call them behavioral cusps, where like this skill will lead to this skill pretty quickly, right? So you want to think of the higher order skill as the one you're writing, and you can get the other ones for free. Okay. And then priorities and trade-offs. I really go back to like, I won't pick more than 3 things. If I have to come back because a student mastered their goal before the plan was done, then it means instruction was well, like it was going great. Oh no, I gotta have that is the way things are supposed to be. We're not supposed to have goals that are on someone's IEP or in their educational plan for 2 years. That's where we get in trouble. That's what the Supreme Court was saying should not happen. Okay. So let me go through. I know we have some questions. Let's see here. Jennifer. Oh, hello, Jennifer. So she says, I love the goal of retelling one episode story with a problem, attempt, consequence, and ending. I'm wondering what suggestions do you have for measurement of that? Accuracy, number of elements, etc. Great question. So I will present a goal idea for that. But since those are discrete elements, I can simply say that, given a single episode novel, single episode story, so meaning it's like they've never heard it before, at a, you can say it's like brief, or you can actually mention the grade level. I don't like doing that if it's not on grade level. But given a brief single episode story that learner has never heard before, so it's novel, they will independently retell that story to include, but not limited to, a complete episode. And I'll put in parentheses, problem, attempt, consequence, and ending. You can use the words complete and coherent, because that, if you're going to use the narrative language measures, the progress monitoring forms, complete and coherent is the score of 2. So by using that definition in the goal, you're not saying that you're only using the cubed. You can't write that in the goal. Most people can't. It makes sense. And so what it is, but you can also, if the student moves elsewhere, someone can interpret your form. So hopefully that helps you. I would not count the number of elements. I wouldn't say accuracy. I would say complete and coherent. Problem, attempt, consequence, and ending. So you're really looking for, when you're doing the measures, a 2-point problem, a 2-point attempt, 2-point consequence, 2-point ending. Because if someone's not using the cube narrative language, they're not going to know what you're talking about if you did accuracy or such. And then we'll say that we're using a narrative language or rubric. So I'll show you a couple goal examples of that. Okay, Julia says, I've heard the criteria for complete episode is at least a score of 3. But what was the criteria you gave to decide if their sentence complexity is strong enough to start focusing on vocab? Great question, Julie. In the back of the cubed manual, you're going to want to look based on that student's grade. So their end of the year standards. How many points do we suggest for having temporal and causal subordinates, noun verb modifiers? We will absolutely provide a guide. And again, similar to what Jennifer was talking about, I wouldn't put in a percent or accuracy. I would say they will use at least 1 or at least 2. That's based on that. So, all right. Here we go. Juan. Hi, Juan. Would you ever make a goal based on the number of narrative elements? The student will retell a story using 6 out of 9 narrative elements with objectives saying they could. Okay. If you can guarantee that you're going to provide a novel story, because that's the key too. We don't want them to be practicing the same story. They'll memorize it. So if you say they will retell a novel single episode, or is it double episode? Single episode story using at least 6 out of 9, you better make sure there's always 9 and no more or less than 9 in every single story, right? So if you can guarantee that, then that's absolutely fine. I like that. I like to also say complete and coherent, so that we're not just allowing them to say he or she for character when in real life, no one knows who they're talking about. You have to use a general noun at least for me to understand a little bit of your story, but I'm going to want a proper noun, right? So the more specific details, I always imagine if this student's plan is going elsewhere, the last thing I want is to be embarrassed for someone to pick this plan up and be like, who the heck was this interventionist that wrote this goal? Because I've seen some of those goals. That was always my legacy. I will never be on the other end and someone's questioning what the heck this goal is. So write it as if someone else could pick it up and deliver intervention, be able to measure it. Ask someone if they understand your goal. It's always a good one. Amy asked, in terms of prioritizing goals, would you move through macro structure and then language complexity? Okay, I'm going to get to that. And then last, Dimitra, excuse me, my screen is covering your name. Does the cubed have any report templates and summarize how the child is performed? That's available in the insight in the digital cubed. All right. So you can also do the training and then we give you ideas if you're using only paper pencil. All right, let me get into actual goals. And I think it's going to answer all of these for you all. Okay. Thank you all for bearing with me. Those of you who are like, oh, what? I'm going to say two things. This will provide a copy of the slides, I do believe. Chrissy, I'll make sure I get you the PDF of these, so, or a link that we can include in the email that they can download from our Dropbox. This is important. This is what you want to make sure that that's in your goal. Okay. So I have a lot to say about this, very little time, but basically, like, are you going to set up a natural opportunity? You're going to go observe the learner while they're at recess and see if they're telling a personal story, because that's a natural conduct. Like, that's natural with another peer, right? Or is it with an adult? Or is it contrived opportunity with an adult? Like, you have to set it up so that you can make sure that you get progress data. So specify in one-to-one setting or in a small group conversation, if that's applicable. Define the observable behavior. There is so much to Google about what is observable and not observable. Quick tip, if a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. We actually have 2 studies published in behavior analysis that prove that if a dead man, that have proven that. Really funny. Tom Critchfield's amazing, but we actually have 2 experimental papers about if a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. Set performance level. This is important. Achievable in the duration of the plan, appropriate, okay? Like some kind of acceptable level of performance. Crossing the street with 50% accuracy is not appropriate, right? Raising your hand with 50%, what? So like, make sure your percents make sense, but I hate, I like to see like an actual count or a duration, right? Those I prefer to see in goals because they're easier for other people to take data on if I don't come back to work tomorrow, right? Heaven forbid. I also want to know where, when, and with whom, okay? And then this part right here, the schedule of data collection, please only collect data, be realistic about how you're going to measure progress, and do so only as often as needed. Please, like behavior analyst old Megan would take trial data, and I was doing more data collection than I was teaching. So my students had very slow progress. I really only needed to take quick data probes at the beginning of my session, or maybe it's like every other week. So ask yourself, if it's not required by your funding agency or the school, ask yourself what's appropriate in terms of, you don't want too much data collection that it prevents you from doing the job that you're supposed to do, which is teaching, right? So only take data as often as needed. Quick note, putting adult behavior in a student's goal. I will forever be on the soapbox. Putting adult behavior in your student's goal means that adult better be with that kid the rest of the duration of that plan. All right. So in real life, I care about independent performance. That's why I'm justifying need for specialized services and intensive targeted intervention. So I write goals based on the learner can independently blah, 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 or a learner will independently blah, blah, blah. I want to know where they're at independently. I can adjust the performance criterion. Do I need them to get 100% accuracy, or is like 3 out of 4, which is 75, 3 out of 4 elements that are complete and coherent? You know, so you have to ask yourself that, but I want independent progress. Again, because there's so many other things that go into this. What if there's some substitute instructional assistant working with their student and they have horrible fidelity? Well, that's why your student isn't making progress. So I trust clinical judgment, and I do not write any student goals with adult behavior in them, because those are teaching techniques. So for example, during small group instruction, X will listen to a peer's personal narrative and then what, right? So these are the contexts, where, when, with whom. All right, sample goals. I'm going to give this to you. Oral narratives. So you want a condition, given a brief novel story, modeled twice. Okay, there is that's a prompt level. So they didn't just need to hear it once. Maybe you have learners that need to hear things twice, but you're not teaching them, anything in between. Independent retell a story. to include a problem, action, and consequence and or ending on 3 consecutive retells per quarter. So I'm only doing it as often as necessary, and I'm measuring it using a narrative scoring rubric, aka the NLM listening. Okay. I don't say the grade level form that I'm using. This one right here, given an opportunity to tell a personal story during natural conversation. It could be, so I'm saying it could be with anybody. I'm going to measure, it could be with me. That was natural. Like, how was your break from school? Tell me what you did. Tell me about a problem that happened this past weekend. Or let's say a natural opportunity pops up between other peer. That's awesome. I can actually just observe it and record. I want Alex to independently generate a personal story, not someone else helping him. That includes at least one problem, one action, one ending. So I'm not even saying it needs to be complete and coherent. It just needs to have these things. And I'm going to do so. I'm going to measure using a narrative scoring rubric. We have the NLM flowchart that comes in the back of the cubed manual. And so you can use that for any context if it's not the actual story that we provide. Other ideas? So you're going to want to go from episode, complete episode, retell, personal. Okay. And then you can work on fictional after that, but don't get too ahead of me. I'm not saying you can't work on vocabulary yet. But if you want to work on fictional because they've got personal down, which is awesome, this would be another idea, presented with a picture, scene, or a photo of some ongoing activity. Right? I always think about the ADOS, but Jackie will independently generate a fictional story that has a complete episode and at least 2 subordinate clauses, right? So I'm embedding 2 different targets. They're working on fictional story generation, and they're also continuing to work on using causal and temporal subordinates. All right. This one right here, given a model story with 4 less common words. So this could just be an oral retell of a story, but I know that story has at least 4 tier 2 vocabulary words, academic vocabulary. They just need to use at least one of those 4. There could be more than 4. They just need one. And that's the level that we're at. So this is some Tarek would basically, we're not working on complete episode. We're working on vocabulary now, right? And this is maybe bi-weekly probes, vocabulary scoring rubric, right? Something that you can make. So I'm not saying that this is all using NLM. It's just easier sometimes. What about, this is one, brief novel story. It contains 3 subordinate clauses. So I picked any story. I'm not saying it has to be cubed NLM, but those 2 have these ready to go. It has at least 3. Delilah will independently retell the story with appropriate use of at least 1 causal and at least 1 temporal subordinate clause, right? So I could write it that way. I could also have a student that, after listening to a kindergarten level story, and so that's Sarah's in kindergarten. If they're higher and they're like 3rd, 4th, please don't put the grade level from the NLM that you're using. Just say a novel, brief, single episode story, right? Just describe it like that. But Sarah's in kindergarten, so I'm going to say to specify the grade level because we're getting her to access the curriculum, but she's not there yet. So can she independently retell a story to include a complete episode and 2 noun verb modifiers, right? And then how am I measuring it? It's the cubed NLM. So these are just ways of like rating story grammar rubric, cubed NLM. Writing goals. After listening to a 1 episode story, told to retell the same story in writing, Megan will, right? And so we've got this right here. You've also got ideas for personal stories with 2 episodes and complex language. So how to write a personal story with 2 complete episodes, 4 modifiers, 4 subordinate clauses. Okay, so you're able to embed all of these in there. Now, let's say that you have these goals, you're delivering intervention. I'm going to refer you back to the quick start guide if you're using Story Champs, right? And that's great because you're going to look at the quick start guide in the kit and you're going to try to find the grade level that matches that goal. All right. And then it will tell you specifically what lesson plan to use, what story level. All right. So, and vice versa, based on what you're using in Story Champs. If you're working on a basic episode, you need to go look at the NLM listening forms and select the corresponding grade level for progress monitoring, no matter what grade level your student is on. They might be in 4th grade, but they are working on, I'm going to use first grade progress monitoring forms. In fourth grade, they're double episode stories in the cubed, the NLMs. That is too difficult for my learner because intervention is only working on a single episode story. So I need to have a measure that closely matches intervention, that is salient to pick up or detect, sensitive enough to detect progress. So it doesn't look like we're not making progress or making the student worse. So you may benchmark initially to get baseline performance using a grade level measure, but then there on out, based on where intervention starts, those are going to be what drive what grade level you should pick. So you absolutely should go pick a grade level that closely matches the story type, the episode. Okay. Meet students in their zone of proximal development. All right. Jennifer says, in our state, we need to track using a numeric value. We can use a rubric, but it must contain a value. Do you have any advice on numeric value? As long as you specify what the value means, because numbers don't mean anything to me if I'm reading a goal and I don't know what it is. So you could put, instead of complete and coherent, but we'll have at least a 2-point problem, a 2-point, action ending. You can assign those. And that's exactly how it would handle those situations, is embed that information about what 2 points means. All right. So I know we're getting close here. So I know I get questions a lot about frequency of intervention. The higher the frequency of intervention, the more you should monitor progress. If it seems that intervention is too easy for a child, or that no progress is being made, it's time to monitor progress. Basically, you want to know if what you're doing is working and if your instruction or intervention is effective, or is something that you're doing not effective, because Story Champs has tons of studies saying that it should work if you're following the actual lesson plans and your assessment methods are valid and reliable, then something's going on and you need to change what you're doing. That's our job. We need to respond to the data. It might be that the students in small group and they need one-to-one, right? Or they only get one session every other week and they need once a week, or the duration of the session, like that. These are the things that we need to think about in addition to how's my fidelity of implementation. So progress monitor only as often as you need to, but you need to do it in terms of if the learner is not making progress or they are making a lot of progress and you want to know if it's time to change your lesson plan or change your intervention or up the ante, right? Got a complete episode? Now you're going to do a complete episode, but a personal story. Or now you're going to do a complete episode, but with one causal or one temporal subordinate clause, right? That kind of thing. So in summary, we do have in Insight progress monitoring that's embedded, right? Graphs. So there's another, basically you have an ironclad IEP if you are systematically and purposely monitoring student learning, and you're analyzing the data and reporting progress to the family and the student, right? So if you're doing this, you can look at what the trajectory is. That gray line is kind of that trajectory of where they should be. And then these little dots. And when you hover over a dot, it gives you more information about, what does this mean? We have it for questions, retell, etc. So more information about that in the CUBE training. We also have more information on like free webinars about progress monitoring. Christy did a webinar that's available on our YouTube channel. So, but back to start with benchmarking, have a baseline, then do intervention and select your progress monitoring forms that most closely match the level of intervention you're doing. Don't pick too hard of a grade level. Don't necessarily stay on the same grade level that you did the baseline measures on. And then adjust complexity as needed. These are all things that we all know. All right, second code word, achievable. So make sure you write this one down so that you can get your certificate. Okay. Achievable. And that brings us to questions and answers. This was quick. These 1-hour webinars are so fast. So I'm going to take 3 more questions. If anybody has any, and then as soon as I have 2 or 3 questions, I will go ahead and then put up the QR code for y'all to take the end of webinar certificate checkout. Christy has also put that in the, thank you, Christy, ahead of me. The webinar checkout form is also there, the link in the chat. Any questions? All right, so I do have resources. We'll share the slide deck for you so that you can get a hold of those example goals. And then this information, IEP tip sheets. This was a great resource that I found. There's also great meta-analysis if you're a glutton for punishment. And then last but not least, there you go for your QR code. If you need to access the webinar certificate, remember those 2 words. Okay, any questions? Okay. All right. Well, then that's going to be it for us today. Thank you for being here. Really quick, I hope I got some answers to some of your questions. Thank you for asking them during the webinar. I really appreciate your time. We will send this recording out with a copy of the slides and webinar certificate. Remember that you need those code words to access your certificate. And we will be available. We'll be sending the email out through our training email so that you can reply directly to us if you have any questions. All right. Thank you all.